Tonight, the world feels quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that settles over mountains and lakes just before dawn, when even the wind seems unsure whether to move. Somewhere, perhaps in the United States, where the night stretches long, or in Europe, where early morning light is just beginning to touch the horizon, or in another distant place where sleep comes slowly, you may be listening with tired eyes and an open mind. If you enjoy slow, immersive stories like this, you are gently invited to like, subscribe, and leave a comment, especially if you are listening late at night or in the early hours, when stories feel closer and time feels softer. Now, settle back, let your breathing slow, let the noise of the day fade. What you are about to hear is not a story of shouting battles or quick victories, but of patience, discipline, and a myth that refused to be remembered. This is the forgotten legend of Isobe Yoshiharu, the samurai who is said to walk upon water. Long before names were written neatly into records, before borders were drawn with ink instead of blood, there was a lake hidden among low mountains and cedar forests. The villagers who lived near it never gave it a proud name. They simply called it the water, as if to speak more loudly would invite trouble. The lake was wide and still. In the early morning, mist lay across its surface like a thin, pale cloth. Birds avoided flying too low above it. Fishermen never rowed to its center. They said the water watched those who tried. On the eastern shore, where the land sloped gently into reeds and stones, there stood a narrow path worn smooth by bare feet and straw sandals. This path led to a small wooden dwelling built simply, without ornament or pride. It was here that Isobe Yoshiharu lived, though few would have called him by name. To the villagers, he was just the wandering samurai. He arrived one autumn without ceremony, no horse, no banner, no retinue. His armor was wrapped in cloth, his swords plain and unadorned. He bowed deeply to the village elder, asked only for water and a place to sleep, and spoke nothing of his past. Samurai were not unusual in those years, but Yoshiharu was different. He did not drink with the men at night. He did not boast of battles. He rose before the sun and walked alone along the shore of the lake, stopping often to stand still, as if listening to something beneath the water. Children noticed first that his feet never seemed hurried. Each step was careful, measured, placed with intention. Even on loose gravel he made no sound. When winter came, the lake did not freeze as it should have. Ice formed at the edges, thin and fragile, but the center remained dark and moving. The villagers whispered that the lake rejected the cold, just as it rejected nets and boats. Yoshiharu continued his walks. Some mornings those who rose early enough claimed they saw something impossible. They said that the samurai stepped where there should have been nothing to step on, that the water beneath his feet did not break or ripple, but held, as if recognizing him. At first no one believed it. Legends are born from tired eyes and morning fog. Yet the whispers grew, carried quietly from house to house, until even the elders began to watch the shoreline more carefully. Yoshiharu never acknowledged their stares. One dawn, as pale light spread across the mist, he stopped at the very edge of the lake. He removed his sandals and placed them neatly on a stone. The water before him was calm, unreadable. He breathed once, slowly. Then he stepped forward. The lake did not move. Those who saw it felt something tighten in their chest. Not fear, not awe, but a deep, unsettling stillness, as if the world itself had paused to witness what should not exist. This was the first time the lake spoke without sound, and this was only the beginning. After that morning, the villagers could no longer pretend they had imagined it. No one spoke openly about what they had seen. Words felt too weak, too clumsy. Instead, people began waking earlier, lingering longer near their doors, pretending to sweep or fetch water while their eyes drifted toward the lake. Yoshiharu changed nothing. Each dawn, he rose before light touched the mountains. He washed his face in cold water, tied his hair with the same plain cord, and bowed once. To the room, to the day, to something unseen. Only then did he walk toward the shore. His training began not with the sword, but with stillness. He would stand ankle-deep in the lake's shallows for hours, unmoving. The water numbed his legs. Wind tugged at his robes. Insects gathered, then left. He did not react. His breathing slowed until it matched the quiet rhythm of the water itself. The villagers who watched grew restless. Some expected chanting. Others expected signs or gestures of power. There were none. Only patience stretched thin over long mornings. Later, he practiced balance on stones, half submerged beneath the surface. Each stone was slick with algae, uneven, unpredictable. He stepped from one to the next without haste, placing his weight as if the stone had already agreed to hold him. When he fell, and sometimes he did not curse the water. He bowed to it. In the afternoons he trained with his sword on the shore. His movements were simple, almost dull to those who expected flourish. One cut, one step, pause, again. Every strike ended in stillness, not triumph. An old fisherman, bent with years and salt, watched him one day and shook his head. "This is not how warriors train," he muttered. But Yoshiharu was not training to defeat men. As days passed, children began to follow him at a distance. He never chased them away. Sometimes he would stop, turn, and bow, as if acknowledging their presence was part of the discipline itself. One brave boy asked him once, in a voice barely louder than the reeds, "Why doesn't the water swallow you?" Yoshiharu considered the question for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and unremarkable, like someone stating the weather. "Because I am not asking it to." That answer unsettled the boy more than any mystery could have. Winter deepened. Snow fell on the mountains, and the village huddled closer to itself. Yet the lake remained open, breathing mist into the cold air. Each morning Yoshiharu stepped farther from the shore, first where water brushed his ankles, then his calves, then his knees. Still the lake did not resist him. At night, elders whispered of forbidden techniques, of monks who trained until their bodies forgot fear, of warriors who learned to place their spirit before their flesh. Some said Yoshiharu must be cursed. Others insisted he was protected by something older than gods. Yoshiharu said nothing. But as the ice crept closer to the center of the lake and stopped, always stopped, something changed in the air. Even those who doubted felt it. The lake was not being conquered, it was being understood, and somewhere beneath the dark surface, something listened. By the third week of winter, the villagers noticed something else. Yoshiharu no longer left footprints. On frosted ground where every step should have marked the earth, his path appeared only briefly, then faded, as if the land itself erased the evidence of his passing. This was not spoken of aloud. It was the kind of thing people carried silently, like a stone in the chest. The village elder, a man who had lived long enough to stop believing in coincidences, finally invited Yoshiharu to share a simple meal. Rice, pickled roots, warm tea, nothing more. They sat across from one another in the low light of early evening. Wind pressed softly against the walls. For a long time neither spoke. At last the elder bowed. "You walk like someone who has already left this world," he said carefully. "Yet you eat and breathe as we do. May I ask, what are you seeking by the lake?" Yoshiharu lifted his cup, watched the steam rise, and set it down again without drinking. "I am not seeking," he replied. "I am remembering." The elder frowned. Remembering what? Yoshiharu's gaze drifted toward the dark window where the lake lay unseen but unmistakably present. "A way of standing," he said, "before the world learned to sink." The words carried weight, though no one could explain why. That night, after Yoshiharu left, the elder sat awake until dawn. He remembered old scrolls his grandfather once spoke of, teachings dismissed as metaphor, stories meant to humble arrogant warriors. They told of balance so complete that the boundary between solid and fluid lost meaning. Most scholars called such texts symbolic. The lake did not. As weeks passed, Yoshiharu's steps carried him farther each morning. Now he walked well beyond where reeds could hide shallow stones. The water beneath him was deep and dark, untouched by ice, reflecting the gray sky like polished metal. There were no ripples. It was as though the surface accepted his weight without question. One morning, snow fell silently while he stood motionless at the lake's center. The flakes touched his shoulders, his hair, the water around his feet, but still the surface did not break. A young woman watching from shore felt tears gather without knowing why. She later said it looked like the world had remembered something it was not meant to forget. Not everyone felt wonder. A traveling retainer passed through the village and witnessed Yoshiharu's walk. He laughed sharply, his hand resting on his sword. "Tricks," he scoffed. "Hidden platforms, illusions. No man defies nature." That same afternoon he attempted to step where Yoshiharu had stepped. The lake answered him. The water swallowed his leg instantly, dragging him down with shocking force. He was pulled free only by villagers rushing with ropes. When he emerged, shaking and pale, he refused to look at the lake again. Yoshiharu watched from shore, his expression unchanged. Later that evening he bowed to the lake, deeper than usual. "Forgive him," he whispered. He stepped with doubt. That was the first time anyone heard Yoshiharu speak to the water as if it could listen, and the first time the villagers understood that this was not a skill to be learned quickly, nor power to be stolen. It was a memory earned through years of silence, failure, and restraint. And Yoshiharu had not yet shown the cost of remembering it. The village slowly learned that Yoshiharu did not measure time the way others did. Days passed, then weeks, marked by frost and thaw, by the low flight of birds and the changing color of the lake's mist. To the villagers, winter dragged like a burden. To Yoshiharu, it moved like a breath, quiet, inevitable, unresisted. One evening, as snow gathered heavily on the rooftops, a child noticed something strange while helping her mother draw water. Yoshiharu stood at the lake's edge, his sleeves rolled back. His hands were submerged, palms open, held perfectly still beneath the surface. Minutes passed, then more. His breath slowed until it was barely visible in the cold air. The child watched, uneasy, certain no one could hold their hands in icy water so long without pain. Later, when asked why he did it, Yoshiharu answered simply, "To remember how it feels to disappear." That night, memories he never shared pressed quietly against him. There had been a time, years before the lake, when Yoshiharu had been like other samurai, trained to cut decisively, taught to advance, to overwhelm, to win. He had fought in battles where the ground turned slick beneath his feet, where rivers ran thick with blood instead of water. Once, during a retreat through flooded fields, he had slipped. Armor dragged him down. Panic seized his chest. Water filled his mouth, his nose, his ears. In that moment, strength abandoned him. Technique vanished. There was only sinking. What saved him was not struggle. It was surrender. He remembered going still, letting the weight pull him, letting the water close over his fear. For one impossible heartbeat, he felt held rather than consumed. Then hands found him. He lived. But something in him never returned to the surface. After that, Yoshiharu left the wars, left the banners and promises. He sought monks who taught him how to stand without tension, how to move without intention. Many turned him away. Some called him broken. Years passed in temples and forests. He learned to balance bowls of water on his head while walking narrow beams. He learned to breathe until his pulse slowed enough to feel the ground listening back. He learned to fall without fear. Still, the final understanding escaped him until the lake. Standing in the cold night now, Yoshiharu withdrew his hands from the water. They were pale, steady, unshaking. He bowed low, his forehead nearly touching the frozen shore. "I remember," he murmured, "but I am not finished." The lake responded not with movement, but with silence deeper than before. By morning, the villagers noticed something unsettling. The lake's mist no longer drifted aimlessly. It gathered closer to Yoshiharu when he walked, trailing him like a shadow made of breath, and those who watched felt it clearly now. The water was no longer testing him. It was preparing him. Spring arrived quietly, as if unsure it was welcome. Snow withdrew from the mountains in thin, reluctant lines. The reeds at the shore softened from brittle brown to muted green. Yet the lake remained unchanged, dark, deep, and unyielding to warmth. Ice vanished from its edges overnight, not melting so much as releasing its grip. Yoshiharu noticed first that the lake no longer waited for him. Before, he had always stepped toward it. Now, in subtle ways, it seemed to meet him halfway. When he walked the shoreline, small waves shifted without wind. When he paused, the water nearest him stilled, smoothing itself as if anticipating his weight. The villagers felt uneasy. They had grown accustomed to watching a man do something impossible. They were not prepared for the impossible to move on its own. One morning, Yoshiharu did not stop at the shore. He stepped forward while still several paces away. The distance was small, no more than the length of a man lying down, but unmistakable. His foot descended where air should have been, where nothing existed to receive it. The water rose, not in a splash, not in a wave. It lifted, just enough to meet him. Those watching gasped, hands covering mouths, breath caught in their throats. The lake's surface curved gently upward, firm beneath his step, then settled again once his weight transferred. Yoshiharu remained calm. But something in his eyes shifted, not triumph, not fear, but concern. That night he did not sleep. He sat near the lake long after the village fires dimmed, listening to the subtle sounds others ignored, the slow draw of water against stone, the faint movement beneath the surface, the quiet pressure of something vast, adjusting itself. "You must not lean toward me," he said softly into the darkness. "This is not your burden." The lake offered no answer. Days later, travelers began arriving. Stories spread faster than mist. a samurai who walked on water, a lake that obeyed. Some came with reverence, others came with ambition sharp enough to cut. One man arrived carrying scrolls and questions, another brought offerings. A third arrived with soldiers, their armor clinking too loudly for the village's narrow paths. They demanded demonstration. Yoshiharu refused. "This is not a road," he told them. "It is a moment. You cannot march across it." They laughed. One soldier stepped forward, confident, arrogant, certain the lake could be forced to reveal its secret. Yoshiharu moved faster than anyone had ever seen him move. He placed one hand on the soldier's chest, not striking, not pushing, and guided him gently backward. "Do not," he said. The lake churned. For the first time since Yoshiharu's arrival, its surface broke, not violently, but unmistakably. A deep ripple traveled outward from the center, reaching the shore with a low, hollow sound. Everyone froze. Yoshiharu bowed to the men, to the village, and then deeply to the water itself. "Forgive us," he whispered. "We are forgetting again." That night the mist rose higher than ever before, swallowing the shoreline, the path, even the sandals Yoshiharu left behind. From their homes, villagers heard the sound of water shifting, not like waves, but like breath drawn too deeply. Something old had been stirred, and Yoshiharu understood with a quiet heaviness in his chest that his walking on water was no longer a private remembering. It was becoming a warning. By the next morning, the mist had not lifted. It clung to the lake and the lower fields, turning familiar paths into pale corridors where distance lost meaning. Sounds traveled strangely. Footsteps arrived late. Voices seemed to come from the wrong direction. The village moved more slowly, as if each person were careful not to disturb something sleeping just beneath the air. Yoshiharu remained near the shore, standing where land and water argued quietly over ownership. For the first time since his arrival, he did not step onto the lake. He watched it instead. The visitors grew restless. Soldiers shifted their weight, hands always near their hilts. The man with the scrolls whispered urgently, insisting this moment must be recorded, preserved, controlled. He spoke of recognition, of favor from powerful lords, of a place in history. Yoshiharu listened without interruption. Then he shook his head. "To be witnessed is to be pulled," he said, "and I am already being pulled enough." No one understood what he meant, but the lake did. That afternoon, Yoshiharu walked into the shallows and stopped. Water closed around his ankles. He did not step farther. He knelt instead, lowering himself until his knees were submerged, his posture straight, his hands resting lightly on his thighs. The lake stirred. Beneath the surface, something shifted, not upward but inward, as if the water were folding around itself. Ripples spread, slow and deliberate, touching the shore like careful fingers. The villagers felt pressure in their ears, the way one does before a storm or a deep dive. Some grew dizzy, others wept without sound. Yoshiharu inhaled. With that breath his weight changed. It was not visible. No light flashed. No water rose. Yet the lake responded as if a great stone had been removed from its depths. The surface smoothed. The mist thinned slightly. Yoshiharu exhaled, long and controlled. The water hardened beneath him. Slowly, deliberately, he rose, kneeling not on water, but on something that was no longer willing to be called liquid. His knees did not sink. His robes did not darken. The onlookers fell silent. "This is what happens," Yoshiharu said calmly, "when attention becomes hunger." The man with the scrolls stepped forward, trembling. "Then show us," he pleaded. "Show us fully. Let the world learn." Yoshiharu looked at him with something like sorrow. "The world already knows," he said. "It has simply chosen to forget." He stood and stepped back onto land. The water released him at once, resuming its ordinary movement, as if embarrassed by what it had nearly become. That evening, Yoshiharu packed his few belongings. The villagers gathered, unsure whether to beg him to stay or ask him to leave. Before anyone could speak, Yoshiharu bowed deeply. "If I remain," he said, "the lake will follow, and what follows me is not meant for crowds." He turned toward the mountains. Behind him, the lake remained perfectly still, watching. Yoshiharu left before dawn, choosing the hour when even birds hesitate to sing. The path into the mountains was narrow and uneven, cut long ago by water rather than feet. Pine needles softened each step, but the ground rose steadily, demanding effort, attention, breath. This was a path that tested the body in simple ways: weight, balance, endurance. For the first time in many seasons, Yoshiharu felt resistance. His steps were heavier. The earth did not yield kindly. Stones rolled when he placed his weight too carelessly. Once his foot slipped, and he had to steady himself with a hand against the rough bark of a cedar. He welcomed it. Behind him the lake lay hidden by distance and trees, yet he could feel it as clearly as if it pressed against his back, not pulling, not chasing, remembering. By midday, clouds gathered low over the peaks. Wind threaded through the forest, carrying the smell of rain and thawing soil. Yoshiharu paused near a narrow ravine where meltwater rushed loudly over stone. He watched it for a long time. Here, water did not listen. It did not pause. It did not wait to be understood. It obeyed only gravity and the shape of the land. "This is how it should be," he said quietly. He stepped onto a fallen log spanning the ravine. The wood was damp and unstable. He adjusted his balance instinctively, breath slow, center lowered. Halfway across, the log shifted. He fell, not far, not dangerously, but enough. He landed hard on stone, the impact sharp in his shoulder. Pain flared bright and immediate, clean, undeniable. He lay still for several breaths, staring at the gray sky between branches. The water below rushed on, indifferent. Yoshiharu smiled faintly. For years the world had softened beneath him. Now it reminded him of its edges. He rose slowly, testing his arm. It moved. Pain remained, but it did not command him. He bowed once, to the ravine, to the forest, to the simple truth of gravity. When he continued, his pace slowed. That night he sheltered beneath a rocky overhang as rain fell steadily. Water drummed against stone and earth, flowing in thin lines toward the ravine. Yoshiharu watched it until his eyes grew heavy. In his half-sleep, he dreamed not of walking on water, but of sinking, not in fear, in trust. When morning came, the rain had stopped. Mist clung to the trees. Yoshiharu stood and took one step forward. The ground held. He took another and another. Far behind him, unseen and unspoken, the lake remained where it was, still, dark, and waiting. Not every path would follow him, and that, Yoshiharu knew, was the balance he had almost forgotten. The mountains opened gradually, not with drama, but with patience. Trees thinned. Stone showed itself more openly. Streams cut clean lines through the land, rushing downhill without hesitation. Yoshiharu moved among them like a guest who did not expect to be recognized. Here, no one knew of the lake. Villages were smaller, poorer, built close to the ground, as if afraid of the sky. People spoke less and watched more. When they noticed Yoshiharu, they saw only a quiet man with a tired shoulder and careful steps. This pleased him. He stayed briefly in one village, helping to carry water from a stream that swelled dangerously each spring. The current was strong, cold, impatient. It pulled at the ankles of anyone who stepped too close. Yoshiharu waded in with the others. The water did not harden. It did not lift. It pushed and pulled like any honest stream should. He adjusted his stance, dug his feet into gravel, leaned forward just enough to resist without fighting. For the first time in many weeks, he was simply a man standing in water. At night he slept deeply. No mist gathered. No silence pressed inward. Dreams came and went without weight, yet something followed him still, not the lake, but its lesson. One evening, a child asked him why he moved so carefully, even when crossing dry ground. Yoshiharu considered the question. Because the ground is also listening, he answered. The child did not understand, and that was as it should be. Days later, Yoshiharu reached a high plateau where rain pooled into shallow mirrors across the stone. Clouds reflected there, broken and distorted by wind. He stepped across them without thought. His foot slipped. Water splashed up his leg, cold and sharp. He laughed softly, once surprised by the sound. Nothing held him. Nothing followed. Yet, as he continued, he noticed something subtle. Where he walked, the water stilled briefly, then resumed its restless movement. Not obedience, recognition. Yoshiharu paused and bowed, not deeply, not formally. Enough, he said quietly. You do not need to remember me. The wind scattered the reflection. The water forgot. As night fell, he realized something he had avoided naming before. The lake had not taught him how to walk on water. It had taught him when not to. And perhaps that was why the story would fade, why no scroll would preserve it cleanly, why his name would soften into myth, then silence. Because the truest disciplines do not survive being explained. They survive only by being released. Yoshiharu turned back toward the lowlands without announcing the decision, even to himself. The mountains did not resist his leaving. Paths opened naturally. Weather shifted without warning or favor. He walked for days through changing light, sometimes under open sky, sometimes beneath branches heavy with rain. His shoulder healed slowly, the ache dull and steady, a reminder that he still carried weight. When he reached the first familiar fields, the land looked unchanged, but he had. The village by the lake did not recognize him at first. Children who once watched from a distance now ran past him without fear or curiosity. Adults nodded politely, seeing only a traveler with worn sandals and quiet eyes. The path to the shore remained smooth and narrow, but fewer feet used it now. The lake lay, as it always had, wide, dark, unreadable. No mist gathered at its center, no surface lifted in anticipation. Birds skimmed it freely, their reflections breaking the water without consequence. Fishermen stood at the edges again, careful, but no longer afraid. Yoshiharu felt relief. He approached the shore and stopped, leaving a respectful distance between himself and the water. He bowed, not deeply, not formally, then sat on a stone and watched the light change across the surface. For a long time, nothing happened. Then a ripple crossed the lake, not toward him, not away, simply across, as if a thought had passed and moved on. Yoshiharu smiled faintly. You remembered? He said softly. Now, forget. He stood and turned away. This time, the ground took his weight fully. His steps marked the dust. Each footprint remained where it was placed, ordinary and temporary. By evening the lake was behind him again, and the village lights flickered on as they always had. No one followed, no one recorded the moment. And that was right, for myths do not fade because they are false. They fade because they are finished. Years later, when memory thinned like old cloth, the elders of the village gathered on a winter evening to decide what should be taught and what should be allowed to disappear. The fire was low. Outside, the lake lay quiet, reflecting nothing but darkness and a few unsteady stars. One elder spoke of the wandering samurai who once stayed by the shore. Another corrected him, saying the man had been a monk. A third insisted it was a dream shared by many during a strange season. They argued gently, without urgency. There were no records to consult, no name written with certainty. Only impressions remained, early mornings that felt heavier than usual, a silence that once pressed close to the skin, a sense that something had passed through the village without ever belonging to it. One elder, older than the rest, said nothing. He stared into the fire and remembered a man who bowed to water, who refused applause, who left before being asked to stay. He remembered footprints that vanished too quickly, and others that did not. At last he spoke. "If we tell it," he said, "it will be misunderstood." "If we don't," another replied, "it will be lost." The old man shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "it will become lighter." They let the fire die lower. Outside, the lake made no sound at all. Children born after that winter never heard the full story. They heard only fragments, a rumor that the lake once behaved strangely, a saying about balance, a warning not to rush where depth could not be seen. And that was enough. Because the lesson was never meant to be carried whole. It was meant to be stepped away from, carefully, without looking back. Time moved on, as it always does, without ceremony. The seasons continued to pass through the village like familiar guests. Spring softened the reeds. Summer warmed the stones along the shore. Autumn returned color to the mountains. Winter came quietly, laying thin ice at the lake's edge and retreating again. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm, and yet from time to time someone would notice a small disturbance, nothing dramatic, nothing that demanded explanation. A fisherman would feel the water steady briefly beneath his boat, just long enough to regain balance. A child would slip on wet stone and land unharmed, as if the ground had shifted to receive them. A woman drawing water at dawn would sense a calm so deep it made her pause, hand resting on the bucket, breath forgotten for a moment. No one connected these moments. They were too small, too gentle. Years later, travelers occasionally asked about the lake. Had it ever frozen fully? Had it ever flooded? Had it ever taken a life? The villagers answered honestly, "No more than any other water," they said, which was true. As for Yoshiharu, his name did not survive intact. In some retellings, he became many men. In others, he was no one at all, only a way of speaking about patience or restraint, or the strange feeling of standing still when the world expects movement. Some said he died in the mountains. Some said he wandered until even memory could not follow. Some believed he had never existed as a man, only as a test. The lake never confirmed or denied any of it. On certain mornings, when the mist lay low and the surface was perfectly smooth, one might imagine a single step pressing lightly at the center, just enough to disturb nothing. But imagination, like water, takes the shape it is given, and the truth, whatever it was, had learned to walk away. Long after the elders were gone, Long after even the arguments about what should be remembered faded, the lake remained. It did not ask to be protected. It did not demand reverence. It accepted nets, boats, birds, and weather with equal indifference. To an outsider, it was ordinary water, deep, cold, and patient. Yet those who lived beside it inherited something without being told. They learned to step carefully at the shoreline. They learned not to shout into stillness. They learned that force was not the only way forward. No one said why. A boy growing up near the lake discovered he could stand on a narrow beam longer than others without falling. He became a carpenter, known for building bridges that did not creak, even under heavy weight. A young woman who fetched water every morning developed a way of carrying full buckets without spilling a drop. She became a healer, her hands steady even in moments of urgency. A fisherman who once nearly drowned learned to move with the current rather than against it. He lived longer than most. None of them spoke of Yoshiharu. They did not need to. The discipline he had practiced did not pass through stories. It passed through posture, through breath, through restraint learned without instruction. Once, many years later, a traveling scholar camped near the lake and noticed something unusual. He observed that the water here responded differently to disturbance, waves settling slightly faster than expected, reflections returning more quickly to calm. He made notes. He drew diagrams. He prepared a theory. Before he left, an old villager approached him and said gently, "Some things behave differently because they are not being asked to prove anything." The scholar laughed politely and wrote nothing of that conversation. That night, as he slept near the shore, he dreamed of standing on water, not above it, not in defiance, but within it, supported by stillness rather than strength. When he woke, the dream slipped away, as it should, because inheritance is not about what is explained. It is about what remains when explanation is no longer needed. There came a year when the lake fell unusually low. Summer heat lingered longer than expected, and the streams feeding the basin thinned to narrow veins. Stones long hidden emerged along the shoreline, pale and unfamiliar, as if the land itself were remembering an older shape. The villagers adjusted. They always did. Boats were dragged farther to reach water deep enough to float. Nets were cast with more care. Children were warned not to wander too far out, not because of danger, but because the ground beneath the water could no longer be trusted to behave as before. No one spoke of balance, yet balance was everywhere. An old man slipped one morning while carrying firewood. He should have fallen hard. Instead, he twisted just enough, catching himself against a post. Later, he could not explain how he had done it. "I moved without thinking," he said, "as if the ground told me where to step." In the evenings, when the lake reflected the red and gold of the setting sun, the surface sometimes smoothed all at once, even when wind still brushed the reeds. The moment never lasted. It came and went like a held breath, released. No one pointed it out. That was the rule now, though no one remembered when it had been made. Once a stranger arrived, a young warrior with polished armor and restless eyes. He asked questions about strength, about secret techniques, about rumors he had heard secondhand. The villagers listened politely. Then one of them said, "If you're looking for something to stand on, you will sink." The warrior frowned. "Then what should I stand on?" The villager shrugged. "Whatever is already holding you." The warrior left the next morning, disappointed. The lake did not react, because the lesson had never been about water. It had been about weight, where it rested, how it was carried, and when it was finally set down, and that was a lesson that could not be demonstrated, only lived. The year the rains returned, they did not come gently. Storms gathered over the mountains and broke open all at once, sending water racing downhill in wide, careless sheets. Streams swelled beyond their banks. Paths vanished overnight. The lake rose steadily, day after day, until it reached places it had not touched in generations. The villagers watched with quiet concern. This was not fear, it was attention. They moved what needed moving. They reinforced what could be reinforced. They did not shout at the water or curse the sky. They worked slowly, deliberately, resting when rest was required. Still, one night, the lake pushed farther than expected. Water slipped into the lowest homes, shallow but cold, seeping across floors and carrying the smell of earth with it. People woke to the sound of it, not crashing, but arriving, persistent, patient. In the confusion, a young boy ran too quickly along the shore. His foot caught on a submerged stone. Newly hidden by the rising level, he fell forward, arms flailing, and disappeared beneath the dark surface. There was no scream, only the sound of water closing. A fisherman closest to the shore moved without hesitation. He did not rush wildly. He stepped into the lake with careful speed, feeling for depth, for pull, for the shape of the bottom. Others followed, spreading out instinctively, forming a line without being told. The water pushed against them, heavy and cold. It resisted. It did what water does. Yet for a brief moment, no longer than a breath, the surface between them stilled, not hardened, not lifted, simply steadied. Enough. Hands found the boy. He was pulled free, coughing, shaking, alive. The stillness vanished at once, the lake resuming its restless movement as if nothing unusual had occurred. No one spoke. They carried the boy home, wrapped him in blankets, sat with him until his breathing slowed. By morning he slept peacefully, unaware of how close he had come to silence. Later that day, an old woman stood by the shore and looked out over the water. "It didn't help us," she said quietly. "We helped each other." And that was the truth. If Yoshiharu had been there, he might have bowed. If the lake had been listening, it did not say so. Balance, after all, is not something that appears to save you. It is something that reveals itself only when you are already moving correctly. After the floods receded, the lake returned to its familiar shape. Marks remained along the shore, dark lines on stone, bent reeds, bits of debris caught in branches. But the water itself showed no sign of strain. It lay open and quiet, as if nothing had happened. The villagers cleaned and repaired what was needed. Roofs were mended, floors dried. Life settled back into its ordinary rhythm, slower now, more deliberate. One evening, the boy who had fallen into the lake sat with his grandfather near the shore. The water reflected the fading light, broken only by insects skimming the surface. "Grandfather," the boy asked, "did the lake save me?" The old man considered this carefully. "No," he said at last, "it didn't stop us." The boy frowned, trying to understand. The old man continued, his voice calm. "There are moments when the world does not move against you, but that does not mean it moves for you. It only means you have reached a place where your fear is not in the way." The boy looked down at his hand, still small, still unsure. He nodded, though the meaning would take years to arrive. That night, the lake was perfectly still. For a moment, only a moment, it seemed possible that someone might step out onto it, not in defiance, not in display, simply because they did not expect it to fail them, but no one did, and that too was part of the inheritance. Because the greatest sign of mastery is not the step taken without sinking. It is the step never needed at all. As years folded quietly into one another, a rule settled over the village without ever being declared. It was not written. It was not taught. It was not enforced. Yet everyone followed it. No one tested the lake. Children played along the shore but never dared one another to step farther than felt natural. Fishermen respected the water's moods, turning back when instinct whispered rather than when danger shouted. Travelers were welcomed, but those who spoke too eagerly of conquest or mastery found no encouragement here. It was not superstition. It was familiarity. The lake was not feared, and it was not revered. It was regarded the way one regards a quiet elder, capable of kindness, capable of indifference, never impressed by noise. Sometimes, on calm mornings, villagers noticed something subtle in themselves. Their steps aligned unconsciously with uneven ground. Their breathing slowed when tasks grew difficult. Arguments faded faster than they might have elsewhere. No one connected these things to the lake. And yet, if Yoshiharu had returned unseen, he would have recognized the posture immediately. This was the stance he had sought all those years ago, not on water, but in life. One winter evening, a traveler stayed the night and remarked how peaceful the village felt. "What do you do differently here?" he asked. An innkeeper thought for a moment, then shrugged. "We don't lean," he said. "Not too far forward, not too far back." The traveler laughed politely, not understanding, and went to sleep. Outside, the lake lay dark and still, holding nothing, offering nothing, perfectly content to remain what it was. And that contentment spread quietly without permission. Generations passed. The village grew, then thinned, then grew again. Houses were rebuilt with stronger beams. Paths shifted slightly as feet chose easier ground. The lake remained at the center of it all, unchanged enough to feel eternal, altered enough to resist certainty. From time to time, a version of the old story resurfaced. A traveling storyteller once claimed a samurai had crossed the lake in full armor, sword raised, as villagers knelt in awe. Another insisted the water had turned to glass beneath holy feet. A third said the man had vanished mid-step, swallowed without trace. Each version was louder than the last. The villagers listened politely and said nothing. They had learned that stories grow heavier the more they are carried. Eventually, they sink under their own weight. One evening, a young girl asked her mother whether any of those stories were true. Her mother answered honestly, "They are all reaching for the same thing," she said, "but none of them are touching it." "What was it?" the girl asked. The mother paused, then smiled gently. "A way of standing that doesn't need proof." The girl thought about this for a long time, then ran off to play. That night the lake reflected the moon so clearly it seemed possible to step into the light itself. Wind touched the surface, breaking the image apart, and the reflection vanished without complaint. Truth behaved the same way, and that was why it lasted. There came a time when the village faced a decision that could not be delayed. A lord from a distant region sent envoys with plans to dam the lake's outlet, promising protection, trade, and prosperity in return. The proposal was detailed, carefully measured, supported by confident voices and precise drawings. The envoys spoke well. They spoke of control. The villagers listened. They did not argue. They did not protest. They asked questions, slow ones, thoughtful ones, about water levels, seasonal changes, unseen pressure beneath the ground. The envoys answered quickly, dismissively. Finally, one villager asked a simple question: "Where will the water rest when it has nowhere to go?" The envoys laughed softly. Water does what it's told, one said. The villagers exchanged glances. They asked for time. That night, no one slept easily. The lake lay quiet, reflecting nothing. Wind passed over it without raising a ripple. It was the stillness that comes before a choice, not before a storm. By morning, the villagers had decided. They refused the dam. Not loudly, not defiantly, simply, completely. The envoys left, confused and offended. They warned of consequences. They promised regret. None came. Years later, a flood devastated nearby regions where rivers had been forced into obedience. Walls broke, channels failed. Water reclaimed what had been narrowed too far. The village by the lake remained untouched, not because the lake protected it, but because it had never been trapped. Silence, it seemed, had answered first, and the villagers had learned to listen before asking why. Long after the envoys and their promises had faded into rumor, an unusually dry autumn revealed something no one expected. The lake receded farther than it ever had in living memory. Stones emerged in careful lines, some smooth, some sharp, forming a faint path that stretched from the eastern shore toward the center. It was not straight. It did not announce itself. It appeared the way old truths sometimes do, only when pressure eases. The villagers noticed, and then deliberately stopped noticing. They did not clear the stones. They did not measure the distance. They did not test whether a man could walk from one to the next. Yet an old woman, nearly blind, asked to be guided to the shore. She knelt with difficulty and placed her palm on one of the newly revealed stones. It was warm from the sun, worn smooth by water and time. "This is where he stood," she said. No one asked how she knew. She did not mean the final step. She did not mean the farthest reach. She meant the moment before any of that mattered, the place where weight settles, where breath steadies, where a decision is made without being forced. The lake remained low for several weeks. Then the rains returned, slow and patient. Water rose. Stones disappeared again, one by one, until nothing but open surface remained. The old woman passed that winter. No marker was placed for her. No marker was needed, because places that matter do not stay visible. They remain available. After the stones vanished, the village returned to its quiet routines. Nothing changed on the surface. Nets were mended. Paths were walked. Seasons moved forward with the same steady patience they always had. And yet something subtle had settled more deeply into the people who lived by the lake. They no longer asked what might have happened there. They understood that asking would only pull the past back into a shape it did not wish to keep. Children grew into adults without being told to respect the water. They learned it by watching how their parents paused before stepping, how they tested footing with a toe instead of charging ahead, how they accepted being turned back without anger. The lake never demanded belief. It never asked to be remembered. Once, during a particularly still evening, a man visiting from far away sat alone at the shore. He had heard fragments of old rumors and felt disappointed by the ordinary appearance of the water. "It's just a lake," he muttered. A local man, passing behind him, answered without stopping. "Yes," he said, "that's the point." The visitor stayed silent after that. As darkness settled, the surface reflected the sky cleanly. Stars appeared, unbroken, resting where they could not possibly exist. The illusion was perfect and fragile. A breeze passed. The stars shattered into motion. The lake did not try to hold them. And somewhere far beyond names, beyond stories, beyond even memory itself, The lesson that Isobe Yoshiharu had carried so carefully found its final place, not in water, not in footsteps, but in the quiet understanding that the world does not need to be overcome, only met with balance and then allowed to be. There is a kind of moment that does not ask to be marked. It arrives quietly, passes without announcement, and leaves no clear boundary behind. Only later, sometimes much later, does a person realize that something inside them has shifted, and that the shift has no obvious cause. Such moments began to appear more often near the lake. A woman returning home after a long day paused halfway across a narrow plank bridge. The water below moved quickly, swollen from recent rain. She should have hurried. Instead, she stopped. She felt her breath settle. She felt her weight distribute evenly through her feet. She felt no need to go faster. When she reached the other side, she could not explain why her hands had stopped shaking. A young man, known for his impatience, failed repeatedly at a task that required precision. Frustration rose in him like heat. Then, without knowing why, he stepped back, loosened his grip, and tried again. The work went smoothly. He told no one. These were not miracles. They were not signs. They were not gifts from the lake. They were absences of panic, of force, of unnecessary effort. And absences are difficult to praise. Once a child asked an elder why people here seemed calmer than those in other places. The elder thought for a long time before answering. "Because we don't rush to prove that the ground will hold us," he said. "We assume it might, and we move accordingly." The child accepted this easily, the way children accept truths that adults complicate. That night the lake reflected the sky once more. Clouds drifted slowly across the surface, reshaping themselves without resistance. Nothing walked upon the water, nothing needed to. The moment passed, and the world undisturbed continued. As centuries turned, the story thinned further. What remained was no longer a tale told beside fires, but a feeling carried quietly in the body, how one stood while waiting, how one breathed before acting, how one accepted that not every surface was meant to be crossed. In distant places, scholars debated whether such a samurai had ever existed at all. They argued over dates, regions, influences. Some dismissed the myth as an allegory, borrowed from older teachings. Others insisted it was a distorted echo of a real man whose discipline had been exaggerated beyond recognition. None of them traveled to the lake. If they had, they would have found nothing that confirmed their theories. No inscriptions, no relics, no stone marked here as where it happened. Only water, only land. Only a village that had learned not to demand proof. One summer afternoon, a storm gathered suddenly and broke just as quickly. Rain fell hard, then stopped. Steam rose from the ground. The lake shivered under the sudden cooling, its surface briefly unsettled. Then calm returned. A traveler watching from the shore felt an urge, strong and strange, to step forward, not to test, not to challenge, but to see. He hesitated. Something in him remembered a caution he had never been taught. He stepped back instead, letting the urge pass like a wave that did not need to break. He left the next morning without speaking of it. The myth remained intact, not because it was protected, but because it refused to be handled. And so the samurai who once walked on water completed his final discipline, not in motion, not in stillness, but in disappearance. The lake did not keep his footsteps. The world did not keep his name. Only the balance remained. In time, even the village by the lake changed. Roads reached closer, maps improved, names were standardized and recorded. The lake gained an official title, neat and precise, written in ink that did not know how deep water could be. People came and went, yet something resisted being flattened into certainty. Those who stayed long enough noticed it, not as mystery, but as texture. The way conversations slowed here, the way decisions took longer but seemed to settle more cleanly, the way conflict rarely escalated beyond necessity. Visitors sometimes felt restless. They wanted the place to reveal something. They wanted a sign, a story, a demonstration. When none came, they left, disappointed or relieved. Those who remained did not feel the absence. They felt held. On rare mornings when fog lay thick across the surface and the boundary between land and water blurred, one might imagine a figure standing far out, perfectly still. But imagination was the only witness, and imagination, like water, reshapes itself endlessly. The truth, if there ever was one, had long since stepped beyond the need to be remembered. That is why the story does not end with a final step or a final bow or a final word. It ends where it always did, with a lake, with a breath, with a choice not to step forward. There was, in a later age, a man who lived alone on the edge of the village. He was not old, but he carried himself as someone who had learned to wait. Each morning he walked the long way around the lake before beginning his work, even though a shorter path existed. No one had told him to do this. He simply felt better when his day began that way. He did not think of it as ritual. It was just walking. Sometimes he stopped and watched the water. Sometimes he did not. When his thoughts were heavy, he noticed the lake more. When his thoughts were light, it faded easily into the background. He never tried to understand this pattern. One evening, after a difficult season of loss and change, he sat at the shore long after the sun had disappeared. The surface of the lake was dark and unreadable, yet calm. He felt the urge to speak, to ask for something, to explain himself, to demand reassurance. Instead, he stayed silent. He listened, not for answers, not for voices, just for the absence of noise inside himself. Minutes passed, then more. His breathing slowed, his shoulders loosened. The ache in his chest softened, not because it had been solved, but because it no longer needed to be resisted. When he finally stood, he felt steadier. The lake had not changed, and yet he walked away carrying less weight. Years later, he would tell no one about that evening. He would not think of it as important. He would not connect it to any story or legend. But when others struggled, they noticed that he stood differently, that he waited an extra moment before speaking, that he rarely forced an outcome. They trusted him without knowing why. And so, the lesson continued, not through myth, not through memory, not even through water, but through people who never realized they were listening. When the man by the lake grew older, his walks became shorter, not from weakness, but from economy. He no longer needed distance to settle himself. A few slow steps near the shore were enough. Sometimes he did not reach the water at all. He would pause where the ground dipped slightly, feel the balance of his weight, and turn back. People noticed, but did not ask. In the village, gestures were allowed to pass without explanation. One spring morning, a child tripped while running and scraped her knee badly. She cried hard, more from surprise than pain. The older man knelt beside her and did not rush to fix anything. He waited until her breathing slowed, then cleaned the wound carefully. "It still hurts," she said. "Yes," he replied. "But you're standing again." She nodded, accepting this as complete. Years later, That child would grow into someone others sought out during difficult moments. She had no special words. She simply knew how to wait without making things worse. No one ever told her where she learned that. As the older man's hair thinned and his back bent slightly, he stopped walking the lake entirely. He sat more often now, watching light move across water, content to remain still. When he died, there was no ceremony by the shore. People gathered quietly, helped one another, shared food, then returned to their lives. The lake lay unchanged, indifferent and familiar. Nothing had been lost, because what he carried had already been set down, piece by piece, in the way others moved through their days. Balance does not end, it only changes hands. After the old man was gone, the lake looked no different. It did not darken in mourning. It did not still itself in recognition. It did not offer signs. Water, after all, does not remember people. It remembers shape, pressure, movement. Children born afterward swam in the shallows during hot summers, splashing and laughing. Fishermen pushed their boats out at dawn, feeling the familiar resistance against wood and oar. Storms came. Storms passed. The lake rose and fell as it always had, and yet, subtly, quietly, the place continued to shape those who lingered near it. People here learned to pause before answering difficult questions. They learned to test ground before committing weight. They learned that force often created more resistance than progress. If asked why, they shrugged. It's just how things are here. Somewhere far away, a scholar once wrote that myths survive because they explain the unexplainable. But this myth survived because it explained nothing at all. It offered no instruction, no proof, no reward. Only a way of being that felt lighter than struggle. If Isobe Yoshiharu had been remembered at all, it would not have been for walking on water. It would have been for knowing when not to, and the lake, faithful to its nature, let even that memory dissolve. Long after names stopped mattering, long after anyone could say, when the lake first shaped the village, there remained a calm that outsiders could not quite explain. It was not silence. It was not peace. It was something steadier. Disagreements still happened. Loss still came. Weather still ruined plans, and age still bent backs and slowed steps. But beneath all of it ran a quiet understanding. Rushing rarely helped, and forcing never lasted. People here argued without trying to win. They worked without exhausting themselves. They rested without guilt. When hardship arrived, they did not ask why first. They asked how to stand. A traveler once described the place in a letter, struggling to find words. They don't seem fearless, he wrote. They just don't lean into fear. That letter was never famous. It was folded away, then lost, which was fitting. Because the calm did not belong to paper, it belonged to posture, to breath, to the small pause before action. And somewhere, deep beneath the lake's surface, or perhaps nowhere at all, the last echo of a man who once walked upon water found no reason to rise again. The lesson had already moved on. There came a day remembered only because it passed unnoticed. The sky was clear, the lake was calm. Work was done at an ordinary pace. Children laughed. Elders rested. No storms gathered. No accidents occurred. No decisions altered the course of the village. Nothing happened. And yet, years later, someone would recall that day as important, though they could not say why. Perhaps it was because nothing demanded attention. Perhaps it was because no one felt pulled forward or pushed back. Perhaps it was because balance, for once, required no correction. On that day, a man stood at the water's edge with a bundle of tools. He paused, feeling the firmness of the ground beneath his feet, the steady pull of gravity doing exactly what it was meant to do. He did not test the water. He did not think about legends. He simply adjusted his stance and continued on his way. If a samurai had once walked here, if such a thing had ever truly happened, there was no trace left to find. Only the quiet competence of people moving through their lives without needing proof that the world would hold them. And that was enough, because when nothing happens and nothing is missing, balance has already been achieved. In the farthest edge of memory, beyond dates and retellings, there was once a traveler who stayed longer than planned. He arrived with the usual restlessness, maps folded too often, questions sharpened by ambition, a sense that something important waited just ahead. Like many before him, he had heard fragments of a story. Like many before him, he believed the fragments pointed toward a secret. He rented a small room near the lake. Days passed, then weeks. At first, he watched the water closely, expecting movement to reveal meaning. He rose early and stayed late, scanning the surface for signs, ripples that lingered too long, reflections that behaved incorrectly. Nothing obliged him. Slowly, his watching changed. He began to notice the way people walked near the shore, how they shifted their weight before stepping onto damp ground, how they paused when conversations grew tense, letting silence do work words could not. One evening, sitting alone, he realized he had not thought about the legend all day. This unsettled him. He tried to summon the questions again, but they no longer fit cleanly. They felt heavy, unnecessary, like armor worn indoors. On his final morning, he stood by the water with his bag already packed. The lake was calm, not unusually so, just calm. For a brief moment, an idea crossed his mind that perhaps he could try just once to step forward. The thought passed, not because of fear, not because of doubt, but because the need was gone. He turned away without regret. Years later, he would struggle to explain why he left that place changed. There had been no revelation, no teaching, no proof, only a quiet adjustment, and sometimes that is the deepest kind of listening there is. In the end, what remained was not a lake, nor a village, nor even a story. What remained was a way of meeting the world. It lived in the pause before a foot touched uncertain ground, in the breath taken before a difficult answer, in the choice to yield without retreating, to stand without forcing. Those who carried it never announced themselves. They did not gather followers. They did not speak of mastery. They simply moved with less friction, as if the world were something to cooperate with rather than overcome. The lake continued to exist, as lakes do, sometimes calm, sometimes restless, sometimes reflecting the sky so perfectly it felt unreal, sometimes breaking into fragments at the slightest wind. No one asked it to prove anything. And so, long after the name Isobe Yoshiharu softened into silence, long after the myth lost its edges, the truth found its most durable form. It became ordinary, and ordinary things, practiced quietly and without pride, endure longer than legends ever could. What could not be claimed could not be lost. That was the strange durability of what remained. In places where people argued over ownership, of land, of ideas, of truth itself, the lesson quietly slipped away. But here, where no one tried to hold it, it stayed. A craftsman repairing a broken wheel learned this without realizing. He stopped forcing the warped wood and instead loosened his grip, letting the shape reveal itself. The wheel held longer afterward. He shrugged and said nothing. A mother calming a frightened child did the same. She did not hurry the fear away. She waited beside it until it thinned on its own. The child slept. No explanation was given. A man facing a hard choice walked the long path around the lake at dusk. He did not decide while walking. He simply adjusted his pace until his thoughts slowed enough to stand evenly. The decision came later, without effort. None of them believed they were practicing anything special. That was why it worked. Because the moment a teaching is claimed, it demands defense. And the moment it demands defense, it stiffens. It becomes brittle. It sinks. The lake understood this long before people did, and so the teaching remained unclaimed, moving lightly, leaving no prints, carrying no name. Over many years, the shoreline changed, not suddenly, not dramatically. Grain by grain, stone by stone, water wore down sharp edges. Sediment settled where it was allowed to settle. The line between land and lake shifted so slowly that no one could point to the moment it happened, only that it had. The villagers adapted without discussion. Paths curved instead of resisting. Small bridges were moved rather than reinforced beyond reason. Gardens were planted where the ground proved willing, not where pride insisted they should be. No one called this wisdom. They called it practicality. Yet practicality, practiced long enough, becomes something deeper. It becomes a way of listening. On calm mornings, the shoreline looked almost deliberate, as if it had been shaped by careful hands. On stormy days, it looked unfinished, temporary, honest about its limits. Both were true. A child once traced the edge of the water with a stick, following every small inlet and curve. When she finished, the line was uneven, imperfect. "It doesn't look right," she said. Her mother smiled gently. "It looks like it's still alive." The child accepted this and ran off. And so the shore remained, never fixed, never wrong, never demanding to be crossed in a straight line, just like the lesson it quietly carried. There is a discipline more difficult than learning something new. It is the discipline of returning to a pace that feels honest, returning to a way of standing that does not demand attention, returning to simplicity after complexity has proven heavy. Those who lived by the lake practiced this without naming it. When ambition rose too sharply, they returned to routine. When grief threatened to harden into bitterness, they returned to work done slowly, with care. When pride whispered that they had mastered something, they returned to not testing it. The lake offered them endless opportunities to forget and remember again. It changed daily, never enough to alarm, never so little as to feel fixed. It invited attention without asking for judgment. It accepted presence without reward. Once, a young woman who had left the village for many years came back after failing in a distant city. She arrived tired, disappointed, certain she had wasted time. She walked to the lake at dawn. Nothing happened. No insight struck her. No clarity descended. The water lay still, doing what water does. She sat anyway. After a long while, she realized her shoulders had dropped. Her breath had slowed. The urgency that had followed her across mountains loosened its grip. She stayed, not because the lake promised anything, but because it did not. And in that absence of promise, she found the space to begin again. Returning, she learned, was not moving backward. It was choosing not to sink under the weight of what no longer fit. There comes a point when effort becomes unnecessary, not because the task is finished, but because the body has learned where to place itself. For the people by the lake, this arrived quietly. They noticed it in small ways. Workdays that ended without exhaustion, disagreements that dissolved before turning sharp, decisions that felt clear without being rushed. Nothing dramatic marked the change. It was as if an invisible weight had been set down somewhere nearby, and everyone felt the relief without seeing the burden itself. The lake continued its patient cycle. Some years it rose generously, other years it withdrew, revealing stones and darkened roots. It never apologized for either. It never explained. People learned to match it. When times were generous, they did not overreach. When times were lean, they did not panic. They adjusted their footing and continued. An old saying emerged, spoken casually, without attribution. Stand where you can breathe. No one remembered who said it first. One evening, after a long day, a man sat near the water and realized something unexpected. For the first time in his life, he was not bracing himself against what might come next. He was simply present. The lake reflected his shape imperfectly, broken by soft movement. He watched the reflection distort and reform, then fade as light disappeared. He did not need it to stay. Because balance, once learned deeply enough, does not require reminders. It carries itself. There is a place effort reaches and can go no farther, not because the task is complete, but because pushing would undo what has already been achieved. The people by the lake came to recognize this place instinctively. They felt it when muscles tightened without reason. They heard it when voices rose just a little too quickly. They noticed it when thoughts began to circle instead of move forward. At that point, they stopped. Not permanently, not in defeat, just long enough. The lake modeled this better than anything else. It accepted rain until it could not, then let excess flow away. It held stillness until wind arrived, then allowed itself to move. It did not cling to either state. One afternoon, a carpenter worked too long trying to perfect a joint that would not align. His hands grew sore. His patience thinned. Finally, he stepped away and sat by the water. He did not think about the joint. He watched the lake instead, how small waves met the shore and broke apart, how no single wave insisted on reaching farther than it could. When he returned to his work, the solution came easily. He did not credit the lake. He did not need to. The place where effort ends is not a destination. It is a boundary, one that keeps things from collapsing under their own weight. And once learned, it appears everywhere, in hands, in breath, in the simple wisdom of knowing when to stop. As time stretched on, something unusual became clear to those who paid attention. No single person could claim what the village had become. There was no founder to honor, no master to quote, no moment that could be pointed to and named the beginning. Even the lake resisted ownership. It belonged to no one, not truly. It could not be improved without being diminished, nor preserved without being altered. Attempts to define it always fell short, and so, what endured had no owner. The way people moved, the way they waited, the way they let things settle instead of forcing them into shape. These habits passed quietly, like a shared posture learned without instruction. A visitor once asked an old resident, "Who taught you all this?" The old resident smiled, confused. "Taught us what?" The visitor gestured vaguely, at the water, the paths, the pace of conversation. The old resident followed the gesture, then shook his head. "No one taught us," he said. "We just stopped fighting what was already holding us." The visitor did not write this down. It sounded too simple, but simplicity, like still water, often carries the greatest depth. In the very late years, when even the shape of the village began to soften, silence changed its character. It was no longer something people feared or filled quickly. It became kind. Conversations ended without urgency. Long pauses were allowed to stretch without explanation. People learned that silence did not mean absence, it meant space. At the lake, this was most clear. Visitors who arrived expecting revelation often left unsettled, saying the place felt unfinished. Those who stayed longer discovered something else. The silence here did not judge them. It did not ask who they were or what they wanted. It simply allowed them to exist without pressure. One evening, a child asked her father why the lake never spoke. Her father looked out across the water for a long time before answering. "It does," he said, "just not in words that rush." The child nodded, satisfied, and skipped stones that sank immediately, as stones do. The lake did not object, and somewhere beyond the need for memory, beyond the need for story, whatever had once learned to walk lightly upon the world had fully dissolved into it. Not lost, not erased, simply returned. By then the lesson was no longer something anyone could point to. It moved the way air moves, felt, not seen, essential, not announced. People did not say, "This is how we do things here." They simply did them. When someone stumbled, another adjusted without comment. When tempers rose, someone else slowed the pace. When uncertainty appeared, it was allowed to stay long enough to clarify itself. No one claimed this as virtue. Virtue demands witnesses. This required none. The lake reflected the sky as it always had, sometimes clear, sometimes broken by wind. In winter, thin ice formed at the edges and retreated again. In summer, insects traced brief lives across the surface. Nothing about it suggested legend. And yet, those who lived near it often felt less divided inside themselves than people elsewhere. Their thoughts did not pull so hard in opposite directions. Their bodies learned to agree with gravity instead of resisting it. It was as if something had adjusted long ago, and the adjustment had simply remained. No name survived for the man who had once walked on water. No proof survived that he ever had. Only the sense that standing correctly mattered more than standing impressively. And that sense, now as common as breathing, drifted through the village like air, supporting everyone, asking nothing in return. Beyond the village, the world continued as it always had. Cities grew louder, roads widened. People argued more quickly and listened less. Power was measured by speed, by reach, by how firmly something could be made to obey. None of this disturbed the lake. None of it needed to. Those who left the village carried its influence quietly, often without realizing it. In distant places, someone would pause unexpectedly in the middle of an argument. Someone else would choose a slower path without knowing why. Another would step back from a decision that felt urgent but wrong. No one connected these moments to water. They felt like personal choices, private instincts, unremarkable shifts in posture and breath. And because they were unremarkable, they endured. The world did not notice what it had received, and that was precisely why it kept it. The lake never spread its lesson outward. It did not teach. It did not persuade. It simply remained what it was, and allowed those who passed near it to adjust themselves accordingly. Influence without intention leaves the deepest mark. Nothing walked on water anymore. Nothing needed to. The balance had already moved on, unnoticed, into the wider world. If there was ever a final step, it was never taken on water. It was taken in ordinary moments, so ordinary they escaped notice. A breath before speaking, a pause before acting, a decision to stand rather than push. These were the steps that lasted. The lake remained where it had always been, receiving rain and light, releasing mist and reflection. It asked nothing of those who came near it. It offered no proof to those who demanded one. And somewhere in the deep quiet of what had once been called legend, the name Isobe Yoshiharu rested without weight, not remembered as a man who defied water, but as someone who understood it. The world never needed a samurai who could walk on water. It needed people who knew when to stop trying. And so the story ends where it began, not with a miracle, not with a disappearance, but with the ground beneath your feet, already holding you, whether you test it or not. The final step was never forward. It was the moment you realized you were already standing. After the story ended, nothing closed. There was no final image to hold on to, no lesson underlined, no voice insisting you remember. The lake remained a lake. The people remained people. The world continued in all its unevenness. And that was intentional, because the kind of story that lasts an hour and a half is not meant to stay with you as words. It is meant to loosen something quietly, so that when you return to your own life, you notice small changes you cannot fully explain. A slower breath, a softer step, a moment where you choose not to force what does not need forcing. If you forget the name Isobe Yoshiharu, the story still works. If you doubt the lake ever existed, the story still works. If you remember only a feeling of standing, of balance, of not sinking under unnecessary weight, then the story has already done enough. Like water, it does not follow you. It simply leaves you lighter. And now, gently, it steps back. There is often a pause after a story like this, not the kind that waits for applause or explanation, but the kind that invites you to notice where you are standing, your chair, your breath, the quiet weight of your body meeting the floor. This pause does not belong to the lake. It belongs to you. Somewhere outside the story, life continues to ask for movement, for decisions, for effort, for direction. The habit is to lean forward, to rush, to test whether the surface will hold before feeling how you are standing upon it. But now, for a moment, you may notice something else, that your shoulders can soften without falling, that your breath can slow without stopping, that the ground beneath you has been holding your weight the entire time without needing proof. Nothing mystical is happening. Nothing needs to. This is how balance feels when it is no longer a goal, just a condition quietly met. And when you move again, the story does not ask you to carry it. It asks only that you place your next step with the same care Yoshiharu once placed his, on land, on water, or on nothing more than attention itself. The story loosens its grip here. It does not follow. After attention returns to the room you are in, there is often a gentle resistance to standing up. Not laziness, not reluctance, just the body confirming where it is. This, too, is part of the story's shape. In the village by the lake, evenings often ended like this, people lingering a little longer than necessary, not because they had nowhere to go, but because the moment asked nothing of them. Lamps were lit slowly. Doors closed without haste. Night arrived without ceremony. No one tried to hold it. Night, like water, does not respond well to being grasped. Somewhere in that softness, the last echo of the myth settled completely, not into memory, not into belief, but into habit. The habit of not rushing the end of things, because endings, when forced, tend to fracture. And this one did not wish to fracture. It wished to dissolve, just as water does when it meets water. When you finally rise and move on, you do not carry the story with you in any deliberate way. You do not rehearse it. You do not summarize it. You do not look for places to apply it. It travels differently. It appears later when you hesitate before responding, and realize the hesitation feels right. It appears when you stop pushing a situation that has grown heavy and feel relief instead of loss. It appears when you trust your footing, not because you tested it, but because you noticed it was already there. In the village by the lake, this was how all things endured. Nothing was guarded, nothing was preserved, nothing was explained too clearly, and so nothing was broken by being held too tightly. The lake never needed footsteps to prove it could hold weight. The samurai never needed witnesses to confirm his discipline. The story never needed belief to remain true. What mattered was lighter than memory. It was the quiet confidence of standing where you are, without leaning forward into fear or backward into regret. And when that confidence appears in you, briefly, unexpectedly, you will not think of water. You will simply stand. Somewhere, perhaps very far from here, there is a lake you will never visit. It has no name you would recognize, no story attached to it that survived intact, no sign telling you to slow down or pay attention. And yet, one day, you may find yourself standing beside something ordinary, a street, a room, a quiet moment between tasks, and feel the same stillness that once lived beside that forgotten water. Nothing dramatic will happen. Your life will not change direction all at once. No great realization will announce itself. You will simply notice that you are not leaning anymore, not forward into worry, not backward into regret, just standing, balanced, held by something you did not need to test. That is where the samurai finally went, not into legend, not into water, but into moments like that, moments that do not belong to anyone, and therefore endure. The lake remains wherever it was, and so do you, already standing,